So welcome to the first chapter of Rethinking Rural, Global Community and Economic Development in Small Town West by Dan Albright. This will be the main text for our social studies course this fall, and these videos will guide you through the text. So how to use these videos. So first thing first, you want to make sure that you have your designated social studies notebook. It's the same notebook you want to use for the entire semester. And get out some different pens and colors so that you're ready to take really vibrant, detailed, kind of wild notes with pictures and doodles and underlines and bolds and different things like that, because it will help the information stick in your brain. You want to have the reading ready in hand because you're going to be flipping through it. And so then third, as you listen to the video, you're taking your notes and you're following along in the section of the printout of the book so that you can see what I am referring to as I'm talking. You're going to need to pause the video regularly to be able to do both of these things, either finish your notes or find the section that we're looking at. Once you've completed the video and your notes, you're going to go ahead and read the whole chapter. And hopefully watching this video will have prepped you to understand what the author's talking about. But you want to really mark up the book. You're circling and looking up words that you don't know. You're highlighting sections that you don't understand or you have questions about. You're underlining and starring. But again, the more you really mark it up, the more likely you are to remember the information. Then you're going to go look at the questions that are posted on your classroom assignment, and you'll answer them in your notebook, and you really have to go into your text for the most part to answer them. And last, you will type those answers into Google Classroom, and we'll share them with others. So that's how these videos work, and let's get started. So this is chapter 1 of Rethinking Rural by Dan Albright, and you can see the formal citation of the book down there in case you ever need to use it in your homework to cite a quote or something like that. This chapter is broken up into 4 sections, and you'll see them here bulleted. The small town and isolation. So what does it mean to be isolated? If you don't know what that word means, then now is the time to pause the video and go look it up. And then he looks at small town in mass society. And what does he mean by mass society? So we're starting to look at more of a group mentality and being somewhat connected to the outside world and the masses. And then third, he looks at small town and global society, the world, the globe. And so distinguishing features. To distinguish means to set it apart. What are the characteristics or the features of global society that set it apart from these previous phases of isolation or mass society? And then what are the consequences and implications? So what is the impact, or what effect does it have, or what does it mean for small town, rural West, this big global society? What does it mean, or how does it impact our small town, rural West? And then he gives us an example from Wayne County, Utah, and we'll compare that to our own Taos, New Mexico. I'm going to read just the very first paragraph here. It says, "No community is an island. Communities have always been affected by events occurring outside their boundaries. This is especially true of the communities of rural West. Circumstances such as technological development and changes in the economy resulted in some communities having significant advantages over other communities. Later changes drastically altered the slope of the playing field. Consequently, once disadvantaged localities exploded demographically and economically, while once prosperous communities struggled. Each externally imposed change brings with it a whole new set of ecological and socioeconomic issues and concerns." So if we just pick that apart, he's saying no community is on its own. Nobody's an island. They're always affected by events that happen outside in the larger nation or throughout the state or in the world. And he's saying, especially in the rural West, there's been a lot of change. And he says that he talks about the slope of the playing field. So, that we're all out there as communities struggling to grow and prosper and be healthy. And sometimes ones that didn't do so well over time really exploded and now doing very well. And other ones that were once wealthy and rich are now ghost towns. And then he says the externally imposed. So external means outside as opposed to internal, inside. So when we have these outside changes that impact these small towns, we get a whole new set of ecological, so environmental or ecological meaning of pertaining to the natural world, and socioeconomic, so social status and economic status. We get all kinds of issues and concerns that come along with this change. And so we're going to look at in this book, what are all the things that impact rural towns, and from the environment to economics to social dynamics, and that will be our lens for understanding social studies in this course. So the first section in this chapter he calls Small Town in Isolation. So we're looking at early on in the time period of westward expansion, and this is something that you might see on the social studies test. And that was really in the late 1700s and early 1800s when the settlements from the east coast of the United States really began to expand westward. And we had Lewis and Clark out there exploring the West, and homesteaders coming out in their caravans and really moving outwards. One thing to keep in mind is that the West was not empty. It was heavily populated by very many different populations of Native peoples, and so there you can, it's very important to keep in mind the impact on the United States as people started to move west, as Europeans started to move west, and that's when you start to see a lot of the decimation of the indigenous populations of this country. And then he talks a lot in this chapter about traditional resources. So what are traditional resources? These are things like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, mining. So initially, really wealth was created, and the main jobs and the main livelihood was directly connected to the land. So you would go out hunting, or you would set up a mine, or you would cut down timber. So these are our traditional resources. He talks again in this section also about ecological constraints. So ecological is an important word to know and to have in your vocabulary. Ecology, so again, pertaining to things of the natural world and how the ecosystem, how everything gets along. And so in nature, we have this very fine balance where the populations of different species have to stay in check. And if you start to get too many of one thing, it throws everything off. And so in the West in particular, we had ecological constraints as compared to the East Coast because we didn't have a lot of rain, so it typically is drier. We didn't have a lot of forests, so we didn't have as much timber. And so you start to see that the normal farming and fishing and things like this that people were used to gaining their livelihood from were more scarce in the West. The other thing he talks about of importance right away is this word anthropocentric. And it's important here, again, I encourage you to pause the video and look up anthropocentric. Anthropocentric, meaning human, and the human-centered, human-centric, so that humans are first. And so initially back in that time, a lot of these people who were Europeans moving out west really thought that the humans were an exception to nature, and that it was really our job to just conquer nature, and nature was there to serve us, and humans were really apart from nature. And so particularly for these people moving west from Europe, their mindset was really human separate from nature. And then you can see in the blue box here, if you want to take a minute, these will be the questions that we'll be looking at in this chapter. So what time period, how are rural communities similar to each other? Why did a lot of the West struggle or not do well in this period? And how did people define the purpose of the natural environment in this period? The second section in the chapter is called Small Town in Mass Society. So what does he mean by mass society? So here we start to look at this idea of metro versus non-metro. So metropolitan, you'll sometimes see that, is a city. Metro means a city. Non-metro means a rural town. So metro versus non-metro is another way of saying rural versus urban. Urban is like a city environment. And so then we start to see a time period moving from, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up to the 1970s, where rural society and these very small Western settlements really start to have more connection to the outside world and to the metro urban city world. Communication changed. Suddenly we have trains and ways to get around, and the invention of cars eventually, and telephones. And so you really have technology that allows people to access the same information and to get around better. Transportation changes. And you can imagine that people now can sit in their television and in their living room and watch the television, and for the first time ever, all watch the same show. And it starts to create a commonality amongst rural people where they've all seen the same TV show. And then you start to get more of a mass kind of thinking, common things you're watching, common news, common information, fashion, style, things like that start to be more common. And that's common in mass. So you get a mass society, as opposed to the very isolated communities that really didn't have much connection to the outside world. And you start to see the jobs kind of change, where from this very subsistence, traditional resources, you still have that, but we now start to have an era where we start to build more machines, again with the technology. So you have manufacturing and assembly lines. And so the jobs start to change as we start to build more. And of course, farming starts to expand and bigger farms. And then we'll look at population trends. So it was also when you suddenly can take a train to the city or get to the city, you start to see a lot of the small rural towns in the West, the population going down as people move to the city in search of better jobs and education and to be part of that mass society. It's also in this time that you start to see people talking about the conservation and preservation of resources, realizing that the resources, particularly in the West, are scarce and precious, for example, water, and that how are we going to conserve and preserve our resources to ensure for the future. And a few questions here in the blue box is, again, what time period are we talking about? And looking for two things on page 4 that helped reduce isolation in the small town West. And then how did things change? Finding examples on page 4 and 5 of how things really changed in this time period. So one thing that's very important for the social studies test is being able to work with charts and graphs. And often they will give you purposely confusing charts. And often on the social studies, they're looking at trends, like how people move to different places over time. So that's part of our social environment, is where people are at and where they want to be. So on the left here, we can look at the time period. So it runs from 1800 to 1985. And then the amount of people there, it says in the millions on the left. And it gives us a title. So this is American population growth. So I assume that we're looking at the United States as opposed to all of South and North America. But so it's a little vague, but we're assuming this is the U.S. population growth in this time period. So if you start to look at his section, at what point did cities overcome rural population? So you can see back in the, say, 1860 that a lot of people were out living on homesteads and farms and little settlements, and that the cities were not as overpowering or so big then. And then at the crossover, and this is the kind of thing you want to pay attention to on a graph, just before 1920, you start to see, so maybe around 1900 or 1910, something like that, you start to see that the urban growth, urban again means city, starts to really skyrocket up and eventually intersecting and overcoming the rural population, and then you see it really skyrocket. So this really pertains to the time period that he's talking about of the mass small town and mass society, where suddenly there was transportation that allowed people to get to cities and manufacturing jobs and a real big growth and boom in the economy. So a lot of people left the hard subsistence life of a rural community to go to a city to find better work. And it says what could have caused this change. So those are the things that we're talking about, communication and transportation and change in economy, manufacturing, and access to jobs. So those are just the kind of questions that they'll ask. On the right, I put in another graph, and you can take a moment to look at what's the time period, how many people are we talking about, and what information is missing, and just what you notice. To be honest, this is more typical of the type of graph you'll see on the test where there is information missing. Even the population in millions is odd because then they write it as 1,000, 2,000. So it is a little bit more confusing, and then they have all these different lines with different symbols on it. So go ahead and pause the video here and take a minute to really try to figure out what's happening and just what you notice. Take down some notes about what you notice about this graph. So on to the next section of the book, which is small town and global society. And then we're also going to look at the distinguishing features of the global society. So he defines globalization very simply as the internationalization of markets. So what does that mean? So taking a market, so we're going to sell our radishes that we grew at the market, and there's a market for radishes because people love radishes and buy them up. And then you start to think about, well, there's so many radish lovers, I think I could sell them throughout our whole state. And then you think, wow, my farm gets even bigger and now I'm producing millions of radishes. I think I could sell them even nationally, and I'm famous for my radishes. And then as the global market, as the world market opens up, suddenly you could sell those maybe even billions of radishes to people in Afghanistan or France or Uruguay. So all over the world, people could be buying your radishes. And in today's world, when you go to the supermarket, we are buying food that has traveled thousands and thousands of miles from global markets all over the world. So that's what he means by the internationalization, meaning that internationally, between countries, suddenly the markets opened up and we can sell products all over the world. And so he looks a bit at how that came about. And the Cold War is an important era to know about for the social studies test and for world history in general. And he looks a little bit at what communism is and capitalism. So you'll do a little bit of homework on your own to make sure that you are familiar with what these things are. And again, at trade and how things got very competitive, where suddenly I'm competing against somebody in France who also grows really good radishes, as opposed to only competing against my neighbor. So you see that all over the place, not just in economic markets, but also like in the arts. If you're a songwriter, you used to just have to be famous in your little town or your state or in the nation. And now you have to outcompete performers all over the world. And so that is our global world. He also talks about how the jobs change again. So we had initially these very, hand to table, I'm going to go out and hunt and fish and support myself that way. And then we started to have more growth in farming and manufacturing and factories and the mass society. And now in global society, you see what they call creative class jobs and a lot of tech jobs. And creative class jobs are people who are doing marketing or promotion or networking or consulting, all kinds of things that can be done from home, and it matters less where you live. The same with tech jobs, so a lot of software and coding and things like this. So the economy really becomes global and jobs become global, where you might do work for a company that's in New York City but live in Taos. And so he looks at all these different shifts there. The questions for this section are, again, what time period are we talking about? And then to really take some time to define globalization in your own words. So that's an important key concept that you'll find going forward in college, or if you turn on the news. It's something that is very important to our modern world. So take some time to define that in your own words. And then what was the Cold War? So you're going to need to do some internet research or ask around and really figure out for yourself what was the Cold War. You're going to look up communism and capitalism, and we'll look at that a little bit more in the next slides. And what kind of economy do we have here in the United States? So these are all important things, baseline things to know just about how we function as a country. And then really looking at how was it that the end of the Cold War really changed society. That's what he's talking about here. So in your own words, how did the end of this Cold War and globalization really change society, especially for small rural towns? So here we have a little cartoon about the two sides of the Cold War. And it was called the Cold War because the two main countries, so at that time it was the USSR and like in the area of Russia and Eastern Europe, versus the capitalistic countries, which was headed up by the United States. And they had very different philosophies of how the economy should be run and how the government should be involved in our economy. But the two countries never had, their armies themselves never fought. So it was called the Cold War because they didn't actually fight. But they had a lot of what they called proxy wars. So other countries that were more neutral or trying to decide if they were going to be a communist or capitalist, then Russia or the United States would get kind of support a war, that country to go to war to try to make them become capitalist or communist. And so many of the wars like Korea and Vietnam that happened in this time period from the 1950s all the way up to the 1990s happened as proxy wars in the Cold War. And they were really about this battle between capitalism and communism. It's important to think about the role of greed and how that plays into both communist models and capitalistic models and the impact, and think about how should a government respond to greed. So you're going to want to take a moment here to pause and go through the attached hyperlink and do some research on your own about the differences between communism and capitalism. So hopefully you took a little bit of time to understand more about communism and capitalism, and you could figure out which side of this cartoon is the communist side and which is the capitalist side. And so you have at the bottom these people, the struggling masses, people who are suffering and wanting help and needing to change their lives. And the big government answer is, well, let's help stabilize them. Let's make sure that they have food and housing and enough resources to get on their feet so that then they can create change in their lives and they're not starving to death and homeless. On the free market side, they're saying, well, people just need to kind of climb their way out to get to freedom. And the criticism here is that the rungs are broken, that we need more pieces to the ladder, that people can't reach the ladder. And so that people feel like we need to have more steps to help people get out of their circumstance. On the other side, they're saying we don't have enough food to sustain feeding people. And so there are criticisms on both sides. One being that the system is broken and that there's not enough steps to get out. And on the other side is that we can't possibly sustain taking care of people and continuing to feed them in that way. And it's not just about food, but it's really just about, in general, kind of government handouts. It's very important to know when we're looking at these is that government handouts happen on all levels. They go out to big corporations and huge international companies and big banks, all the way down to an individual person who's trying to get on their feet. So that's one philosophy. And the other philosophy is really like, you better just learn how to jump higher and grab that ladder and pull yourself out. And that also pertains to big companies all the way down to an individual level. So we're still looking at the global society, small towns in the global world, and what are the consequences and the implications? So what is the impact on the rural West, small towns in the rural West, like Taos? So one shift that you also start to see in this time period, and again, we're talking about modern society, so that the traditional resources, and if you remember, those were things like timber and fisheries and mining and wealth that we get from pulling it out of the earth. You start to see a shift here to what they call amenities resources. And one of your questions here are, what are amenities? And so he talks about that a little bit. And amenities are when we can just have value for something because it's beautiful. So again, this idea that we hike up to the waterfall, and the waterfall has value because it creates a special thing for us to do with our families, or it helps quiet our mind, or we can go up there and hang out with our girlfriend and make out, and that's fun. And so that there's value in the waterfall for just because it's beautiful. So things like hiking and biking and camping and sightseeing and going, tourists love to go look at the gorge. That would be an amenity resource. And so it brings typically a tourist economy where people want to come where these amenities are. And so you start to see this word aesthetics. And aesthetics is a really good word to know. It can just mean like your baseline fashion, like what's your style? What are your aesthetics? And then all the way up to what are the aesthetics of your home? How do you decorate your home? Or in architecture, how do we build our buildings? Like you get in debates in Taos, like we don't want to build buildings that look too modern because it would ruin the aesthetic of our adobe traditional homes. And then you start to look at the aesthetics of the natural world. So again, that waterfall is a beautiful in and of itself, or our mountain is beautiful in and of itself, or our sunsets are really beautiful. So those are high aesthetics or high fashion, if you think of it in that way, that the earth has a really natural beauty. And of that, you have this shift. It says their new environmental paradigm. And what does that mean? And what is paradigm? That is a really good word to write down and look up. And paradigm is like our world view. It's the world we live in. And often in one town, we might live in totally different worlds. And the customs and the tradition and the fashion and the language and how we talk and what holidays we celebrate and where we go out to have fun, those are different for different groups of people because they're living in a different world or a different paradigm. They have a different understanding of how the world works. In this chapter, the author talks about how we really start to shift to really valuing the environment and the natural world and the ecosystem, and seeing that humans are just one piece of that puzzle, and that for everything to sustain and to remain beautiful and healthy, both humans and the natural world have to get along and stay in balance. And those ties right into this, again, this shift where we're valuing the aesthetics or the natural, beautiful qualities of a place. And so we start to get in and looking at what is the relationship of humans and nature, what are the balance of our ecosystems in the West. And again, we start to look at resource scarcity because we don't have a lot of water, and we don't have a lot of endless amounts of oil or timber or mining. And also considering what is the balance of using it now versus making sure that there's still some left for future generations. And then you get into questions of over-conserving, where the economy suffers now because we are conserving too much. And so this is one of the debates that you really start to see when we talk about conflict over resources, is that people see how we should use our resources and conserve them from very different paradigms or very different worldviews. The last thing on here is that bullet that says service sector jobs. So the other thing, when you start to have more of a tourist economy or amenities-based economy, so based on these natural resources and people getting out and hiking and visiting cultural sites and looking at the plaza, is that you start to have service sector jobs. So that's a huge part of our economy. So it's not just restaurants or shops, but also things like lawyers and making sure that people have insurance and to drive their cars to the place. And so in the modern world, we had a really big expansion of service sector jobs. So take a moment to type in and research what is really meant by the service sector. And they require different education and training and different relationships than, say, the natural resource jobs, where you were just out cutting down timber. That's a very different skill set than being in the service industries. And then you have your questions here of what are amenities? What are the 5 aspects of NEP, the new environmental paradigm? That's on page 10. How did the job markets change in this global society? What are the potential problems with service sector jobs for rural towns? And then we have a quote here about nature and solitude are both highly valued resources. Do you agree? And what evidence do we have in our society that this is true? And then this idea around resource scarcity. And why is it important to use natural resources in a way that conserves them for the future? And do you agree that we should do this? And why is this debate particularly important in the West? So this is the last section of this chapter, and he gives the story of Wayne County, Utah, where he grew up. And he kind of walks us through the isolation period from the 1800s to the 1920s, and it's really high altitude, and people couldn't grow things, and people sort of eked out a very kind of subsistence living, and not a lot of people lived there. And then in the 40s and through the 70s, in the mass society, even got harder there, that machines replaced the need for farmers. They had tractors, and so people could also access the cities more readily, and a lot of people left, and the area was kind of dying. And then, starting in the global era, you started to see this big boom where all of a sudden it was considered beautiful, and they wanted to come to Capitol Reef and Canyonlands National Park, which, if any of you have ever been, it's just exquisitely gorgeous and interesting. And people came to hunt and fish and hike and camp. And they started to build vacation houses. And then people who had these creative class jobs, we talked about that. So people who can do consulting from far away, that don't necessarily need to live in the town where their employer is. They can live in their, beautiful vacation home for part of the year and still work from the internet. And so you started to see a lot of people moving in who were more of the creative class. And along with that, includes artists. And then the other piece he didn't mention here is that you probably saw a big boom in the service sector jobs to accommodate all of these people that were partaking in the amenities. And so then there was a big population boom. So my question is, how has this been similar or different to Taos County during this time? So you're going to take a little bit of time at the end of this video in your notes to write down anything you know about how the populations have changed here over time. And if you don't know, to think about how we can find out. Who could you ask? What could you look up on the internet? But how could you really find out how the population has changed here over time? So that's it for chapter 1. We'll be back next week with chapter 2.